widespread trade. From research at Cahokia, we already know that this network stretched far and wide, and East St. Louis itself maintains all of these same connections. One new finding that the sheer amount of data we have from East St. Louis affords us is that exchange and immigration patterns change over time. Early on, we have ceramics from more northerly and eastern sources, and primarily in jar form, whereas later on, during the Sterling phase, the source of exotic items shift to the lower Mississippi River Valley in the south and the Caddo region in the west, with a greater emphasis on bowls and beakers. And that emphasis on vessel type may just be tied to the fact that people in the north make more jars, people in the south are making more bowls. But it is interesting that sort of that northern connection wanes as time goes on. By the Sterling phase, East St. Louis is remarkably similar to contemporaneous sites throughout the region, and bears much more striking similarity to Cahokia than previously imagined. Its people's access to exotic and elite goods are equal to, or even surpass those of Cahokia, based on current evidence. And the presence of crafting workshops for a wide variety of materials such as shell, copper, galena, and pipestone are all noted. This changes our perspective of Cahokian control of these resources. We now know that East St. Louis had access to them and that the labor of their production also occurred on site. Another finding that alters our perception of the local history is the intensity of East St. Louis's occupation. The population of downtown Cahokia shrinks from the Loma to the Sterling phase, while that of East St. Louis appears to grow based on the portion of the site that's been excavated. In fact, estimates of both sites' populations puts East St. Louis above that of Cahokia during the Sterling phase. And speaking of the shifting social dynamics in the region, we're not sure that it actually did have a higher population, but it is growing as a center, while downtown Cahokia is shrinking as an area of habitation at least. Cahokia may have been taking on more of a role as a ceremonial center, while East St. Louis continues to host dense occupation in addition to evidencing intensified ritual activity. The cuts of deer that are found at East St. Louis in the Sterling phase supports a growing population, wherein hunters had to go further afield to procure meat for its residents as resources were being depleted locally. Everything was going really great at East St. Louis, and then it wasn't at all. The site went from being perhaps the most populous center in the Cahokian world, rich in craftspeople, resources, and ritual, to what appears to be a largely vacant Moorhead phase site. This too is in contrast to Cahokia, where the decline was more measured and less abrupt. It's possible that there's a more significant Moorhead presence outside of here, as I've talked about, but the fact that this dense neighborhood is now almost empty is really telling. The one Moorhead neighborhood that is present appears to end only halfway through the phase, by AD 1250 at the latest. And that's down here. Far distant from this, way up there, is an ossuary, or a structure or pit for the deposition of multiple people's bones. A radiocarbon date on this ossuary places it much later than this neighborhood, almost into the subsequent Sand Prairie phase, suggesting that people continued to visit East St. Louis for important events, even if they no longer lived there. And some of those excavations in the 90s also showed that there was moundtop activity near the end of the Moorhead phase. So while we're not seeing people living here, East St. Louis is still being used. The opportunity to excavate at East St. Louis was unprecedented and allowed us to explore both the history of an important precinct of Cahokia and to better understand the dynamics of one of America's first cities. These excavations and later analyses have shown us that East St. Louis had a much deeper history than previously imagined, and that it played a significant role in the formation and success of the Cahokian polity, and perhaps its decline as well. And all of our ruminations over the past years will start to roll out this year. Hopefully we'll have a summary volume out, which will be geared not only towards professionals, but also interested public. They'll have a lot of pictures of what we found, and also interpretations of each aspect of it, the ceramics, the lithics, the human remains, how it ties into the region, to previous things. So if you are interested by this, I hope you do check that out when it comes out. Hopefully we'll be able to get some here for you to get to. So East St. Louis, among other things, was a center of exchange, craft production, and religious ritual as well as a giant precinct that had many neighborhoods within it. Its leaders orchestrated the construction of great earthworks, the erection of large monuments, and the storage of surplus goods. And its end offers no answer to the outstanding question of why did Cahokia collapse. But it does place more pieces in the puzzle, and it tells us about the tempo of this and other events, which together allow us to better understand America's first great city. That's the summary I have for you, but I would be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, we'll have some time for some questions.
I know in Europe that some of the ships have been correlated with periodic climate cycles, what they call the mini ice age. Does what you're seeing seem to show the same sort of thing?
You know, the phase shifts within a period are too brief for that to be a possibility, but definitely the onset of the Mississippian period does correlate with climatic shifts, as does the end of it. We get into a lot of drought as Mississippian society collapses, which by itself is not a reason for society to collapse, especially one who can maintain surplus and command labor. But you know, when you take drought and political upheaval, possibly earthquakes, you've got solar eclipses, it could have felt like the world was falling apart, and people might have really kind of wanted to get out of there with all of those things going on. Yeah.
What about flooding? Because that's always been a problem around that area.
It always is a problem, but it's one that these people were intimately aware of. You know, they've lived in this area for a long time, so they would have known about annual floods, about 500-year floods. They would have had probably a plan for that. You know, certainly an epic flood that covers your village is going to be a problem, but it's not one that they hadn't historically dealt with or were capable of dealing with.
But with the mosquitoes and that sort of population that was around the floods, would that deter them from?
I don't think so. Having read Spanish conquistadors' accounts of how terrible the mosquitoes were and how the people just ignored them, you know, they were dying of mosquitoes, and the native people were just acting like it was any other day.
So in regard to not understanding quite what caused the abandonment of Cahokia Mounts, rather than thinking of it in terms of a forced migration somewhere else, because of the scale of Cahokia Mounts, and obviously there are signs of it being a major trade route, could it be more that in their trading, they were also influenced by other cultures, other tribes, and perhaps it was just an evolution into subscribing to a different tribe, culture, cosmovision. Possibly it was a welcomed, voluntary move rather than a forced.
I do think likely these are voluntary moves. I don't think anybody's making them leave Cahokia. So yes, I think people are wanting to leave. I think more than them being drawn to another place, which if they do have these connections, they're going to know people elsewhere. But more than them being drawn away, I think they probably don't want to be here anymore. The resources are becoming more scarce. You know, when you've got ruling elite who are supposedly talking to the gods and responsible for part of that, they're not doing their job when it's raining too much, when it's not raining enough. It's a real hard job, I think, to be back then, because you're not in control of the environment. So, but I do think you're right. I do think people were choosing to leave. And we sort of see, past the Moorhead phase into the Sand Prairie phase, the American bottom before then has a very specific ceramic assemblage that's unique to the American bottom. And you see people emulating certain things like Ramey jars outside of it. But after the Moorhead phase, the ceramics in the American bottom are nearly identical to those all the way down to the Ohio River and up into the lower Illinois River Valley. So that sort of sameness across such a wide expanse, following the very unique expression, you know, talks about people sort of dispersing and having a more widespread network that's less influenced by one place.
Yeah, you said, I believe, that the East St. Louis site basically collapsed, as opposed to the Cahokia site was a gradual. Any theories as to what happened? Why East St. Louis would have suddenly not been there anymore?
No, you know, and I suspect with the data we have, we're probably just missing a larger Moorhead population somewhere else in the site. but why they left that one area is hard to say. One thing is that the area that we excavated, because there was that Terminal Lake Village, we know that it's one of the earlier neighborhoods at East St. Louis. We've got some of the earlier dates on Mound Building there. So it may be that the draw of the bigger Mound Center where I-5570 goes, that's where all of the largest and probably some of the latest mounds were. It may be that people were just being drawn to that part of the site, and we don't have excavations there yet.
So maybe the total site was not collapsed, just the area.
That's possible, yeah. It is strange that they would all leave this one popular area, but we really can't say that they were completely gone. Yeah.
I was just curious to know what evidence of like structural fires and you were seeing throughout that site, if you attribute it to being just ritualistic, or if there was any specific reason, and if that had anything to do with the sudden departure of that site.
Well, there's two different sets of data which are really interesting. In the MRV corridor where we dug, there are only 13 structures out of maybe 800 that were burned down. And of those, only 2 of them look like they were intentionally burned, or incidentally burned down, like accidentally. They have assemblages on the floor. The rest of them, the houses were cleaned out and they were intentionally burned down, probably just usually for pest problems. You know, you've got lice, you've got fleas, you've got mice. You might just want to burn your house down. You know, it could be a good idea, and that's pretty common at a lot of sites. But then you get down to the I-5570 corridor where they dug in the 1990s and 2000s, and there's a compound of all these storage huts, you know, a dozen or so storage huts that were accidentally burned down, and they had baskets of corn in them, and that was sort of a walled off area. So we're seeing 2 different things. Nobody is coming in and burning down the whole village, but there is this area where they were keeping all their surplus that did get burned down, possibly from hostile action, or possibly it could have been an accident too. Fire spread pretty quickly with this type of architecture. But we were sort of surprised not to see the widespread burning in our area that we'd seen earlier. Yeah.
Have you found anything that was similar to Emerald Mound with floor coverings, different color, dirt with ceremonial?
No. Yeah, and I've been out to Emerald and seen it, and seen East St. Louis. No, we don't. We don't have any of those shrines. We do have special buildings, but they're of a very different nature. So they're more of, you know, based on their size, they're more public buildings as opposed to those smaller shrines. You know, you can only fit so many people in them. But we also don't have those, so those shrines are being reused over and over again. These buildings, they often just rebuild another building next to it or over it. They're not dedicating the same sort of attention or care to maintaining one building. Yes?
Is carbon dating expensive, and how accurate do you think it is in, you know, different layers, plus or minus 50 years type of deal?
It is expensive. It's about, depending on where you go, $500 per sample. And you do want to have, it's best to have multiple samples from the same context because there is that error in there. It is plus or minus 50 years. So when we're talking about a site where we can tell from the ceramics, within 50 years, the radiocarbon dating doesn't do us much good because we can just look at the ceramics and know with greater accuracy what it dates to. It is good for things like that ossuary that we dated. It was all by itself, no ceramics. We have no idea what it dates to. So, you know, it's reliable if you're using a good lab within 100 years. Now it happens that the Mississippian time period unfortunately hits a time in the Earth's magnetic field where things are shifting. So of the time periods you could date is one of the less reliable ones. You will get big curves where it could be up here, you know. So it's not the best scenario for us to be dating. But when you have no dates at all, it definitely gives you a lot more to work with. Yes?
What about deforestation? The forest was just, taking down or rebuilding the walls and the structures and driving the game further out of the city. Did that cause some of the demise of the city itself?
I think it could have exacerbated any other problem they're having. You know, individually, humans are really good at adapting in any way they can. So they might have been able to go across the river to Missouri to get game because there's still, a lot terrain where you wouldn't deforest. There still are animals. But yes, in conjunction with these other things that are happening, it does put more stress on society. And those, the cuts of meat I mentioned, so we're finding a higher percentage of hindquarters of deer at the site, meaning rather than bringing the whole deer back to the site, they're just cutting off the really meaty parts. And the more of that we see, not in association with elite people, the more likely it is the hunters are having to walk further to bring their meat back. So they're not going to carry the whole. So we get more and more of that in domestic contexts, which means, yeah, they're having to go further away to get that meat. Yes.
Do you know anything about the Missouri side?
A little bit. There's Mississippian sites on the Missouri side. There was the St. Louis Mound Center, which was huge and beautiful and almost completely destroyed for fill. You know, they were building railroads, and those mounds were really good-looking spots for fill. But it is very sad. I think about it a lot, actually, because there are accounts, early travelers' accounts, that say that St. Louis should have been the world's 8th wonder. It was so beautiful and magnificent, the mound centers. There was one near the arch called Falling Gardens that was a 3-terraced mound that led down to the river. So all of that is nearly gone, at least testing where those things were, have not proven that there's anything left. But outside of St. Louis, there are still sites being found. There's a lot less roads being built, and that's usually how we're finding these things. A lot of it's still in farm, so there's potential, but it certainly doesn't have the density of the American bottom because we're on a floodplain where there's agriculture. So as far as that goes, yes, there's people over there, yes, they're related, yes, they're interacting, but there's still a lot of holes in that information. Yes?
Can you find any sign of canoes, boats, or river trade?
You know, we haven't found the canoes or boats, but Steve Bowles, who's sitting right there, he's our rock guy, and he's shown that the amount of adzes which are used to dig out canoes, make dugout canoes at East St. Louis is extremely high in proportion to other sites in the area. And given that East St. Louis was on the river on Cahokia Creek, I think he's right in saying that yes, there's a good amount of canoe production here. And we hardly ever find that stuff, so it's the rocks that tell us. Yes?
I have a two-part question. Understanding the context of all these sites, is that better to think of it? I thought you said earlier, think of East St. Louis as like a precinct with Cahokia, or as like sort of like a separate entity with like maybe its own elite sort of operating independently?
Well, we think of St. Louis, East St. Louis, and St. Louis as 3 precincts of one city. So not that it's subsidiary to Cahokia, although it's undeniable that Cahokia's got the biggest mounds, got the most people. So this is where it's happening for real on a Saturday night if you want to really get going. But they are all connected. You know, if you look at the map with all the mounds together, you can hardly walk without hitting another mound along the way, and we don't even know where they all were. So it really would have been this continuous swath. I think it's something like 14 kilometers long swath of continuous mounds. And certainly back then, in their universe, they probably would have thought of themselves as people of this collective place rather than people of Cahokia, East St. Louis, St. Louis.
And then the second part of my question, why would this big diverse population come here? I would think maybe like where Kincaid Mountains is, like where Ohio is, Mississippi River, that would be a more logical spot for major rivers connecting rather than a big river and a little creek.
Right. Part of it is the American bottom is extremely fertile and big. So a lot of bottomlands are not nearly as extensive, both going north and south and wide, as the American bottom. It's a major flyway, and although a lot of those other places are too, you've got tons of migratory birds, being on the river, the fish, all of that. So the resources here are very great. But a lot of it too is chance, you know. It's a good place for a city, so are a lot of other people or places, but this is where it happened to be. And I think the sort of, as you see at East St. Louis, there's sort of a dense terminal lake woodland population that helped bring that about. It is interesting, though, that Cahokia is at the very northern end of the Mississippian world in terms of populous sites. We do get Mississippian outposts up in Wisconsin. They're, places like that, they're very rare. But really, Mississippian starts here and goes south all the way to Florida. And it's strange that the largest ever Mississippian sites, the populous and the earliest, are like in the northeast corner of that. So that's a question I think is worth thinking about some more. A lot of the people who work down there kind of ignore us because we're too cool. So I think they need to think about it too. Why are we earliest, biggest, gone first, and how do we relate to those other sites? Yes.
Where are the artifacts kept now, and what are your thoughts on how and when they will be able to be used by the public?
Aside from the one in the museum, they're currently split between our lab. We have a lab in Fairview Heights, and then our permanent storage is at our central office, which is near Urbana-Champaign. So that's where they go to live forever in like the Indiana Jones warehouse sort of situation. And it is really like that, but with more spiders. And as far as displays go, I would really hope and love that at some point we could have some of that stuff here at Cahokia, because I think the people who want to see it the most are the people who come to Cahokia Mountains, and it's a wonderful museum. So I hope that can happen at some point. Any museum in the world could request to have some of our things and put them on display. So any independent curators or researchers could say, I would love to do, Mississippian pottery display at the Field Museum, and, we would loan it out for those purposes. Yes.
Through your timeline, were you able to index like sickness and disease?
Some, yes. The human remains recovered from the site were in very poor condition because the soil's really acidic. So that kind of limits what we can do. There will be a lot of things that look like graves that are just empty, and they probably once had people in them, and now we can't see that. The ones we have, however, they're relatively healthy people. There are signs of infection. With corn has so much sugar in it. Really, when you get to agriculture, that's when all our teeth start falling out. Before that, you see very elderly Native American people with beautiful teeth. So the dental health is bad. There would have been very painful cavities, things like that. And then there's a little bit of trauma. We've got very little, but some evidence of scalping, people breaking bones, things like that. But there's no epidemics that we can know or widespread diseases. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned, what does it tell you, what does it tell you about immigrants to be?
There are some. So a lot of recent research has been done on the Mound 72 individuals at Cahokia, and that complements the research they're doing right now on the East St. Louis individuals. But I want to say 30% of all the ones they've tested either did not grow up here as children or did not spend any time here at all that they can tell. And that's usually from the teeth. They look at when you drink water throughout your life, certain mineral signatures will be deposited in your teeth. And although they don't have a library of all the water everywhere, they do have a library of the signature for here. So either the signature says, yes, I was here as a child, or yes, I was here as an adult. And you get people who were here as children and left and were buried here. You get people who were not here as children and died here. You get people who are completely immigrant. Yes?
When they did their farming, how far out did they go from Cahokia and St. Louis?
That's a good question that I can't answer. With a population that size, it would have to be extensive. But I've never actually thought about how much corn does it take to feed these people. You have some close by, but the further out your fields are, the harder it is to watch them. There's raccoons, deer, thieves. And we get a lot of farmsteads spread throughout the uplands, up in the bluff. And it's very possible a lot of people, those farmsteads, were growing corn to help feed Cahokia. So in terms of that, they could have been very far away.
We can pump some oxygen in there too.
Okay, I think that's good. Thank you very much.